The silver-framed photo on my mantel captures a moment from 30 years ago. Me at 35, holding 5-year-old James on his birthday as he blew out candles on a homemade rocket ship cake, both of us laughing with identical crinkles around our eyes. For 3 decades, I never missed a single one of his birthdays, until Andrea told me I wasn't welcome at his 40th, not knowing I was the reason they could afford the luxury vacation home where they planned to celebrate it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I became a single mother when James was just 2 years old. My husband, Richard, a commercial airline pilot, died in a private plane crash while pursuing his weekend hobby. One day we were planning our son's future. The next, I was planning a funeral and figuring out how to be both parents to a toddler, who kept asking when Daddy was coming home from the sky. With teaching credentials but no full-time position, I suddenly needed stable work with benefits and hours that would allow me to be present for a little boy who had already lost too much. Dr. Patricia Winters, the principal at Lakeside Elementary and my former mentor, created a position that worked around James's schedule. "Eleanor, you have a gift with struggling readers," she said. "We'll make this work." That job became my anchor for the next 30 years. The balance was never easy. I'd wake at 5 a.m. to prepare for the day, teach until afternoon, rush to pick up James, then handle homework, dinner, bedtime, and finally grade papers late into the night. With my parents already gone and Richard's family overseas in England, there was no safety net. Just me, making it work through sheer determination and the occasional cry in the shower where James couldn't hear me. When James showed remarkable aptitude for mathematics and science, I was determined to nurture that potential. Dating and remarriage seemed like unnecessary complications when my focus was giving my son every possible advantage. Our modest 2-bedroom home in Pine Ridge wasn't impressive, but it was in the district with excellent public schools and a nationally recognized STEM program. I bought it with Richard's life insurance, stretching every dollar. The mortgage consumed nearly half my teaching salary, forcing careful budgeting of every expense. I made certain James had what he needed to thrive intellectually: science kits, summer programs, weekly library visits. When his high school computer science teacher recognized his talent for programming, I picked up weekend tutoring jobs to afford the laptop he needed and coding courses at the community college. "Mom, you work too hard," 15-year-old James once said, noticing me falling. "Asleep over student papers. Education opens doors that stay open," I replied, echoing what my father, a factory worker who never finished high school, had always told me. "These opportunities will build your future." When James was accepted to Westmore University with a partial scholarship for computer engineering, I didn't hesitate to take equity from our home to cover the remaining costs. Some colleagues thought I was short-sighted. I was approaching 50 and should have been securing my retirement. But I'd watched my brilliant son overcome the absence of a father through academic achievement, and I believed in his potential, without reservation. "I'll pay back every penny, Mom," James promised at his graduation, the first in our family to earn an advanced degree. "The startup I'm joining has stock options. When we go public, you'll never worry about money again." For several years, he kept that promise. After landing his position at a promising tech company in Seattle, he would send me part of each bonus, insisting I use it for something special rather than practical expenses. Those gifts allowed me my first real vacation in 20 years, a literary tour of England I'd dreamed about since college, and later, much-needed repairs to our aging home. When James was 32, he met Andrea during a business conference in Boston. Beautiful, ambitious, with an MBA from an elite university, she worked in corporate brand management and shared his drive for success. Their relationship moved quickly, engaged within 4 months, married in an elaborate ceremony at her parents' country club within the year. I sold Richard's collection of vintage aviation books and models, which I'd preserved for James, but he had never shown interest in, to help pay for their wedding. James insisted it wasn't necessary, but I wanted to contribute. Your father would have wanted to give you a proper celebration, I told him, though Richard's collection had been my emergency fund, my last financial safety net. The changes began almost immediately after the wedding. James's weekly calls became monthly texts. His visits shortened or were rescheduled around Andrea's family gatherings, which always seemed to take precedence. When they did visit, Andrea would survey my modest home with barely concealed disapproval, making comments about the quaint decor and retro kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 1990s. 3 years into their marriage, opportunity struck. The tech company where James worked was acquired by a larger corporation, triggering his stock options. Overnight, he had financial resources beyond what either of us had imagined possible. To celebrate, James and Andrea purchased a stunning, contemporary home in an exclusive neighborhood with mountain and lake views, a far cry from the modest 2-bedroom where he had grown up. "Mom, I want to do something significant for you," James said during a rare call without Andrea present. "You sacrificed everything for my education. Now I can finally give back. What do you think about retiring early? Maybe moving somewhere warm?" His generosity touched me deeply. At 62, after 30 years of teaching, retirement seemed appealing, though not financially feasible on my pension alone. We discussed possibilities, perhaps a small condo in Arizona near my college, roommate Diane, or a cottage in a retirement community with built-in social connections. What I didn't know then was that Andrea had her own vision for their newfound wealth, one that didn't include supporting the mother-in-law she had always kept at arm's length. The conversation about my retirement possibilities with James sparked something I hadn't felt in years: hope for a future beyond the classroom walls where I'd spent 3 decades. At 62, my knees ached from years of standing, my eyes strained from thousands of student essays, and the energy I once had seemed to deplete faster each semester. The thought of retiring a few years early with James's help was tempting. 2 weeks after our phone call, James arrived at my house alone, a rare occurrence since his marriage. He carried a folder of printed real estate listings and retirement community brochures. "Andrea has an all-day strategy session at work," he explained, spreading the materials across my kitchen table, the same oak table where I'd helped him with science fair projects and college applications. I thought we could look through these options together. I made tea while James organized the papers into neat piles: condos in Arizona, small houses in Florida retirement communities, even a few options closer to Seattle but in more affordable areas. His methodical approach reminded me so much of Richard that my heart tightened with bittersweet recognition. "These all look lovely," I said, scanning through photos of palm trees and community pools. "But James, this is a major life change. I'd need to consider what makes the most financial sense." Despite his success, I was reluctant to become dependent on my son's generosity. My teacher's pension would cover basic necessities, but little else. James smiled, that confident smile he'd developed in his corporate role, so different from the shy grin of his childhood. "I've thought about that, Mom. I want to set up a supplemental retirement fund for you. Something that provides monthly income beyond your pension." I nearly dropped my teacup. "That's incredibly generous, but—" "No buts," he interrupted, reaching for my hand. "You took equity from your house to put me through college. You worked weekends and summers while other mothers went on vacations. This isn't charity, it's paying back a fraction of what I owe you." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to my eyes. This was the James I knew: thoughtful, appreciative, aware of the sacrifices that had shaped his opportunities. I squeezed his hand, allowing myself to imagine a retirement where financial anxiety didn't shadow every decision. "Let me think about locations," I said. "I'll need to research healthcare options, cost of living differences, what activities might be available." James nodded approvingly. Always the teacher, doing thorough research. He gathered the materials, into a folder. Take your time. When you're ready, we'll figure out the financial details. As he prepared to leave, I packed him containers of homemade soup and fresh-baked bread, a mother's habit I couldn't break even with my son approaching 40. At the door, he hugged me tightly. I'll talk to my financial advisor this week about setting up that account, he promised. And I'll bring Andrea next time. She has great taste. She could help you decide on decorating style for your new place. My smile remained fixed as he walked to his luxury electric car, so different from the used Corolla I'd helped him buy for college. Andrea helping with decorating meant Andrea having input on my living space, my choices, my independence. Still, I reminded myself that compromise was part of being a family. If Andrea's involvement was the price for James's continued presence in my life, I would find a way to manage it gracefully. Over the next month, I researched retirement options thoroughly, creating a spreadsheet comparing climate, healthcare rankings, proximity to airports, for James to visit, and community activities. I even joined online forums for retired teachers to gather first-hand experiences about different locations. When I felt ready, I called James to arrange another discussion. "That sounds great, Mom," he said, though something in his tone seemed distracted. "Let me check with Andrea about our schedule. Things are pretty hectic right now." 2 weeks passed without him calling back. When I finally reached him, he apologized profusely. "Work has been crazy, and we've been looking at vacation properties. Actually, that's partly why I wanted to talk to you. We're considering a lake house about 2 hours from Seattle." "That sounds lovely," I said, trying to hide my disappointment that our retirement discussion had been postponed. "For weekend getaways?" "More than that," James explained, enthusiasm evident in his voice. "It's this amazing property with a main house and a separate guest cottage. We're thinking we could use it for vacations now, but eventually it might become our primary home when we want to get away from the city." Something in his description triggered a thought. The guest cottage, would that be suitable for a full-time resident? A pause stretched over the phone line. "Well, yes, theoretically. It has 1 bedroom, a full kitchen, bathroom." "Why do you ask?" I chose my words carefully. "I was just thinking, if I were to relocate closer to you instead of Arizona or Florida, something like that might be perfect. I'd have my own space but be close enough to see you regularly, and maybe help with grandchildren someday." James and Andrea hadn't mentioned wanting children, but I held on to hope. "That's an interesting idea," James said, his tone non-committal. "Let me discuss it with Andrea." The next call came from Andrea, not James, a first in our 7 years of knowing each other. Her voice carried the professional warmth she used at corporate events I'd attended. "Eleanor, James mentioned you might be interested in the guest cottage at the lake property we're considering. I wanted to discuss that directly." I felt a flutter of anxiety. "Yes, it seemed like it might be a good option for everyone." "I appreciate your thinking," Andrea said in the measured tone that always made me feel like I was being evaluated. "But James and I envision that space for visiting friends, my parents when they come from Boston, possibly an au pair if we have children. A permanent resident would change the nature of the property for us." The message was clear. I wasn't part of their vision for this new chapter. I swallowed my disappointment. "I completely understand. It was just a thought." "I'm glad you understand," Andrea continued. "James feels terrible about this conversation. You know how he hates any kind of conflict. That's why I offered to call. We still want to help with your retirement, of course, just in a way that makes sense for everyone." Translation: in a way that keeps me at a comfortable distance. I thanked her for her candor and ended the call quickly before emotion could overtake my voice. That evening, I received a text from James. "Sorry about the cottage idea not working out. Still committed to helping with retirement. Love you." Brief, apologetic, but offering no alternative plan. I recognized the pattern from the last 7 years, James making promises, Andrea redirecting, James backing away with apologies, but no solutions. The retirement assistance began to feel like vapor, something discussed but never quite materializing into reality. 3 weeks later, I received an elegant envelope in the mail, an invitation to a housewarming at James and Andrea's newly purchased lake property. The party was scheduled for a Saturday, when I had already committed to chaperoning my school's science competition team at a regional tournament, a commitment I couldn't break given my role as faculty advisor. I called James to explain the conflict and ask if I could visit the property another weekend, perhaps for a private tour. "Of course I understand about your students," James said, though his disappointment was evident. "We can definitely arrange another time for you to see the place." 2 days later, Andrea posted photos of the lake house on social media, a stunning modern structure of glass and cedar on a wooded waterfront lot, with a charming stone cottage visible in the background. The caption read, "Our dream retreat is finally a reality. Cannot wait to create memories here with our favorite people." The photos revealed a property far more luxurious than James had described, clearly the result of his financial windfall from the company acquisition. What struck me most was the cottage, perfect in every way for a retirement home, with a covered porch facing the water and garden beds already planted with perennials. It was exactly what I would have chosen for myself. I felt a complex wave of emotions: pride in my son's success, happiness that he could afford such a beautiful place, but also a deep sadness at being so explicitly excluded from their vision of the future. The cottage that could have been my home would instead house occasional visitors deemed more important to their social aspirations. When we finally spoke again, James was full of enthusiasm about the property. "Mom, you have to see the sunrise over the lake. It's incredible. The water turns golden. I sit on the dock with coffee every morning when we're there." "It looks beautiful in the photos," I said. "When might be a good time for me to visit?" "I could drive up for the day if that's easier." "Absolutely," he agreed quickly. "Let me check our schedule. We're there most weekends now." But somehow, the right weekend never materialized. Their schedule was always full with work events, Andrea's family visits, or friends from their social circle. Summer turned to fall, and I still hadn't seen the lake house except through carefully curated social media images. In late September, I received another elegant envelope, this one an invitation to James's 40th birthday celebration, to be held at the lake house in November. The invitation specified cocktail attire and indicated the event would begin with a Friday evening welcome reception and continue through Sunday brunch. A full weekend affair requiring overnight accommodations. I immediately marked the dates in my calendar and began planning what to wear, what gift to bring, and what arrangements I needed to make at school to take a rare Friday off. This milestone birthday felt significant, a chance to reconnect with my son after months of increasing distance. Perhaps seeing the lake house would also reopen our discussion about my retirement plans, which had stalled completely since Andrea's direct call about the cottage. The week before the invitation response was due, my phone rang displaying Andrea's name, an unusual occurrence that immediately triggered my concern. "Eleanor," she began without preamble. "I'm calling about James's birthday weekend." "Yes, I've marked my calendar," I assured her. "I've already arranged for a substitute teacher for that Friday." A pause stretched uncomfortably before Andrea continued, her voice carrying that professional smoothness that always set my teeth on edge. "That's actually why I'm calling. We've had to limit the guest list due to accommodation constraints. The weekend is really designed for James's tech industry colleagues and our mutual friends from the city." I struggled to understand her meaning. "I'm happy to book a room at a nearby hotel if the cottage is full." "The issue isn't just accommodations," Andrea continued. "The events we've planned are very specific to our social circle. Industry networking, water sports, a wine tasting with a sommelier colleague of mine. We're concerned you might feel out of place." The meaning became unmistakable. I was being uninvited from my only son's milestone birthday celebration. "I see," I managed to say, gripping the phone tightly. "And James feels this way too?" Another pause. "James understands the constraints we're working with. He suggested we plan a separate birthday lunch with you the following weekend. Something more intimate where you two can really talk. A separate celebration. An afterthought. Excluded from the real event with the important people in his life." "I understand," I said finally, my teacher's discipline keeping my voice steady despite the pain lancing through my chest. "Please tell James I look forward to seeing him whenever it works with your schedule." After ending the call, I sat at my kitchen table. The same table where James had spread out retirement community brochures less than a year earlier with promises of financial support that had never materialized. The same table where I'd helped him apply to college, the education I'd sacrificed everything to provide. What Andrea didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that the retirement fund James had discussed so enthusiastically wasn't the only financial matter between us. There was something else. Something I had never intended to reveal, but now sat like a weight in my conscience. A secret that would completely change how Andrea viewed the beautiful lake house from which I had just been excluded. After Andrea's call, uninviting me from James's birthday celebration, I found myself unable to concentrate on lesson plans or student essays. For the first time in my 30-year teaching career, I called in sick without actually being ill, needing space to process what had happened. The house felt oppressively quiet as I moved from room to room, touching photographs of James through the years: his kindergarten graduation with a missing front tooth, middle school science fair with his first-place volcano project, high school graduation as class valedictorian, college commencement in his cap and gown, a visual timeline of the life we had built together. Just the two of us against the world after Richard's death. How had we arrived at a place where my son's wife could comfortably inform me I wasn't welcome at his milestone birthday? More troublingly, how had James become someone who would allow it? By afternoon, grief had hardened into something more productive: determination. I went to my home office and unlocked the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, removing a red folder I hadn't opened in nearly 8 years. Inside were documents I had never expected to need, paperwork from a time when my relationship with James was uncomplicated by marriage and money. The folder contained loan documents, specifically a private lending agreement between James and myself. When he had graduated from Westmore University and received his job offer from the tech startup in Seattle, he had needed funds to relocate, secure an apartment in the expensive city, and purchase professional attire. His starting salary was promising but wouldn't kick in for 6 weeks, and he had no savings after years of being a full-time student. I had taken out a home equity line of credit on my house, the same house that had already been leveraged to pay for his education, and loaned him $30,000 to establish himself in Seattle. We had formalized the arrangement with proper documentation, including a repayment schedule once his employment began. James had been diligent about repayments for the first year. Then the startup began struggling, with rumors of layoffs and delayed product launches. When James called explaining that his promised bonus wouldn't materialize, I had immediately told him to pause the loan repayments. "Focus on keeping your apartment and building your emergency fund," I had instructed. "We can revisit the loan when things stabilize." That conversation had occurred 7 years ago. The loan had never been mentioned again, not when the company rebounded, not when James received promotions, not when he married Andrea, and certainly not when the acquisition provided him with sudden wealth beyond either of our expectations. Remaining balance stood at $24,150, with no payments made since those initial months. I had never pressed the issue, considering it a mother's support rather than a true debt to be collected. The paperwork had gathered dust in my filing cabinet, remembered only during tax preparation when I would quietly note that no interest had been received that year. I spread the documents on my desk, reviewing the terms we had both signed. The sale loan had technically matured years ago, with a clause specifying that the full amount would become due upon any significant change in financial circumstances for the borrower. The corporate acquisition that had funded their lake house certainly qualified. Was I really considering this? Using a long-forgotten loan to extract some form of acknowledgement from my son? The thought made me deeply uncomfortable. I had never been a parent who used money as leverage. James's education and early career support had been given freely, with no expectation beyond hoping he would find success and happiness. Yet here I was, uninvited from his birthday, with retirement assistance promised but never delivered, watching from a distance as he and Andrea enjoyed a lakefront property with a perfect cottage that could have been my home, but was deemed too valuable for visitors, more important than a mother. I closed the folder without making a decision, instead reaching for my laptop to distract myself with mindless internet browsing. Almost automatically, my fingers typed Lakeview Retreat Properties, the development where James and Andrea had purchased their weekend home. The website showcased the exclusive community with professional photographs of the pristine lake, towering pine trees, and architecturally impressive homes spaced for privacy. I clicked through to the available properties section, not expecting to find much, given James had mentioned how competitive the market was for these homes. To my surprise, one property was listed as coming soon, a waterfront lot with construction plans already approved for a main house and guest cottage, remarkably similar to what James had described. The listing included the property's history. Originally purchased 2 years ago by a tech executive who had begun preliminary construction before receiving an overseas transfer. The coincidence seemed too perfect to ignore. On impulse, I clicked the Request Information button and filled out the contact form, providing my name, phone number, and a note expressing interest in the property's timeline and price range. I had no intention of actually purchasing anything. My finances couldn't possibly accommodate such an extravagance, but curiosity drove me to seek more details. Within 15 minutes, my phone rang with an unfamiliar local number. Eleanor Jenkins? This is Marcus Whitley from Lakeview Retreat Properties. Thank you for your interest in our Pinecrest Point listing. The real estate agent's voice was warm but professional. I found myself explaining that I was simply gathering information, not seriously in the market. I understand completely, Marcus assured me. Waterfront properties in this development are significant investments. If you don't mind my asking, what attracted you to this particular listing? My son recently purchased in the same community, I explained. James Jenkins and his wife Andrea. They have the Cedar Cove property with the stone guest cottage. A slight pause followed. Oh yes, the Thorndike-designed home. One of our premium properties. Your son made an excellent choice. Lakefront lots rarely become available in that section. The use of Andrea's maiden name, Thorndike, as the primary identifier didn't escape my notice. Apparently, in this world, I was James Jenkins's mother, while he was Andrea Thorndike's husband. Yes, it's quite beautiful from the photos I've seen, I said, swallowing the hurt. I haven't actually visited yet. Well, you're in for a treat when you do, Marcus continued enthusiastically. The craftsmanship in that home is exceptional. If you're considering joining the community to be near family, we do have several smaller properties that might be more suitable than Pinecrest Point. His meaning was clear. He had quickly assessed that a retired teacher wouldn't be shopping in the same price range as her tech executive son. Under normal circumstances, I would have thanked him politely and ended the call. But something, perhaps Andrea's dismissive uninvitation or James's continued absence, pushed me to ask the question that had been forming in my mind. Actually, I'm curious about the financing options that might have been available when my son purchased. He mentioned some special arrangement, but I don't recall the details. This was a complete fabrication, but it accomplished its purpose. Marcus, sensing a potential client referral, became helpfully informative. Ah, yes. Lakeview Retreat offers several financing partnerships for qualified buyers. The most popular is our Legacy program, where buyers with significant assets but complex compensation structures, like tech executives with stock options, can secure favorable terms. We have an exclusive arrangement with Peninsula Trust for these transactions. The name Peninsula Trust triggered a memory. James had mentioned setting up my retirement fund through his advisor at Peninsula Trust. The connection seemed significant. That sounds like what he described, I said encouragingly. Peninsula Trust handled the mortgage? For most of our buyers, yes. Though in your son's case, I believe there was private financing involved as well. Not uncommon in these transactions. Sometimes, family offices or investment partnerships take partial positions in these properties. I thanked Marcus for his time, promising to reach back out if my circumstances changed. After ending the call, I sat with this new information, trying to make sense of what it might mean. James had used Peninsula Trust, the same financial institution he had mentioned for my never-materialized retirement fund. And there was private financing involved, according to the agent. On impulse, I opened my laptop again and logged into my online banking portal. The home equity line of credit I had opened 8 years ago for James's relocation loan had never been closed, though I hadn't accessed it since then. The available credit limit remained substantial. I had been conservative with debt throughout my life, maintaining excellent credit despite modest means. A wild thought crossed my mind. If James had needed additional financing for the lake house beyond what Peninsula Trust provided, could he have somehow utilized my existing line of credit? It seemed impossible. He would need my signature, my explicit authorization. Yet a nagging doubt persisted. James had my social security number, knew my date of birth, and had occasionally helped with my taxes. He was listed as an authorized contact on several of my accounts for emergency purposes. How difficult would it be for someone with his technical expertise to access information electronically? I clicked through to the detailed activity section of my home equity line, scanning for any recent transactions. Nothing appeared unusual until I reached the section labeled Pending Authorizations. There it was, a credit check conducted 3 months ago by Peninsula Trust, exactly when James and Andrea would have been securing financing for the lake property. A credit check I had never authorized or been notified about. My hands shook as I reached for my phone and dialed the bank's customer service number. After verifying my identity, I asked about the Peninsula Trust inquiry. Yes, Mrs. Jenkins, that was in connection with a pre-approval for a secured line increase, the representative explained. It shows the application process was initiated, but never completed. I never applied for an increase, I said, my voice tight with emerging anger. I never authorized Peninsula Trust to check my credit. A long pause followed. I see. In that case, I'll need to transfer you to our fraud department. Immediately. As I waited on hold, the pieces began assembling into a disturbing picture. James, or someone using his access to my information, had explored using my home equity line as part of the lake house financing. They had gone far enough to run a credit check, but ultimately pursued different financing. Whether they had abandoned the plan because it wasn't necessary or because it wasn't feasible, I couldn't know. The fraud department asked detailed questions, creating an investigation case and placing a security hold on my accounts. They explained the process would take time and might require filing a police report if evidence of attempted identity theft was confirmed. Identity theft. By my own son. The thought was so painful I could barely breathe. As I hung up the phone, my gaze fell on the red folder containing the $24,750 loan documentation. Next to my laptop sat my retirement planning spreadsheet with careful calculations showing I could not afford to stop working at 65, let alone the early retirement James had dangled and withdrawn. The contrast was stark. My financial vulnerability versus their lakefront luxury, my continued work necessity versus Andrea's casual dismissal of my presence at a milestone celebration, my decades of sacrifice versus their apparent willingness to potentially exploit my credit for their vacation home. Something shifted inside me, a fundamental reordering of priorities I had maintained for decades. The mother who had sacrificed everything was awakening to the possibility that her generosity had been not just taken for granted, but potentially abused. I reached again for my phone, this time dialing a number I had not called in years. "Harriet Winter's law office," answered a receptionist. "This is Eleanor Jenkins. I'd like to schedule an appointment with Harriet as soon as possible. It's regarding a personal loan collection and potential identity fraud." Harriet had been my college roommate before attending law school while I pursued teaching. Though we lived in different cities now, we had maintained our friendship through holiday cards and occasional phone calls. Her specialty was financial law, particularly for women facing divorce or economic hardship. I had never needed her professional services before, but instinct told me she was exactly the advocate I needed now. "Eleanor," of course Harriet will, "want to see you right away. Can you come tomorrow at 10 a.m.? As I confirmed the appointment, the red folder seemed to pulse with new significance on my desk. What had begun as a mother's support for her son's fresh start was about to become something very different, leverage I had never expected to use, in a battle I had never wanted to fight. Harriet Winters's law office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian in the city's professional district. Though we had remained friends for over 40 years, seeing each other at occasional reunions and exchanging holiday cards, I hadn't visited her professional space before. The waiting room reflected her personality perfectly, elegant but approachable, with comfortable seating and walls adorned with framed photographs of Washington's mountains and coastlines rather than imposing legal certificates. When her assistant led me into her private office, Harriet rose from behind a substantial desk and embraced me warmly. At 65, she remained as I remembered her from college, direct, energetic, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing, though her once auburn hair had silvered completely. "Eleanor, it's wonderful to see you, though I gather the circumstances aren't pleasant." She gestured to a seating area by the window rather than keeping the desk between us. As we settled into comfortable chairs, she added, "Your call concerned me? This isn't like you at all." "It isn't," I admitted, placing the red folder on the coffee table between us. "I've never pursued legal action against anyone, much less my own son." "Why don't you start at the beginning?" Harriet suggested, notepad ready. "What's brought you here today?" Over the next 45 minutes, I recounted everything. James's childhood as a single-parent household, my sacrifices for his education, his initial success and gratitude, his marriage to Andrea, the subtle changes in our relationship, the promises of retirement help that never materialized, the lake house purchase, and finally, being uninvited from his 40th birthday celebration. Throughout my explanation, Harriet took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly listening intently. When I reached the discovery of the credit check from Peninsula Trust, her expression sharpened noticeably. "And you never authorized this credit inquiry?" she confirmed. "Never. I had no reason to interact with Peninsula Trust. The only connection is that James mentioned setting up my retirement fund through them. A fund that was discussed but never created." Harriet set down her pen deliberately. "Eleanor, unauthorized credit checks are serious. They require your social security number and other identifying information. This goes beyond family disappointment into potential financial exploitation." "That's what concerns me," I said, my voice catching. I never imagined James would use my information without permission, but the timing aligns perfectly with their lake house purchase. "And what about this loan?" Harriet asked, gesturing to the red folder I had brought. I opened it, revealing the carefully prepared documentation from 8 years earlier. The loan agreement specified the $30,000 amount, reasonable interest rate, and repayment schedule. Both James's and my signatures appeared at the bottom, properly dated and witnessed. "This is impressively thorough for a family loan," Harriet noted, reviewing the papers. "Richard was meticulous about financial matters," I explained. "After his death, I tried to maintain that same careful approach, especially with significant amounts." James understood. He was heading into the tech industry where everything is done by contract. "And he made initial payments but stopped after the first year?" "Yes. When his company struggled, I told him to pause repayments until things stabilized." But they did stabilize, dramatically so. He's now in a position to buy a lakefront vacation property, yet the loan has never been mentioned again. Harriet studied the contract closely. "This acceleration clause is particularly relevant. Full repayment becomes due upon significant improvement in borrower's financial circumstances. A corporate acquisition triggering stock options would certainly qualify." "I never intended to enforce that," I admitted. "This was a mother helping her son establish himself after college." "Your intention speaks to your character, Eleanor," Harriet said gently. "But James's choices speak to his. The loan legally remains, due, regardless of your past flexibility." She turned to a fresh page in her notepad. "Now, about this lake property. What exactly do you know about its purchase?" I explained what little I knew directly from James, plus what I had gleaned from my conversation with the real estate agent. Marcus mentioned private financing was involved, but didn't elaborate. "Interesting," Harriet mused. "Did James ever ask you to sign any documents related to the lake house? Even something he might have described as routine or for your retirement?" "Planning?" I thought carefully. "No, nothing. But about 6 months ago, he asked me to update my account information for him. Passwords, account numbers, that sort of thing. He said it was for emergency purposes in case anything happened to me." Harriet's eyebrows rose slightly. "And did you provide that information?" "Yes," I admitted, feeling foolish in retrospect. "He's my only child, my healthcare proxy, my emergency contact. It seemed reasonable." Harriet made another note. "With that information, he wouldn't need your physical signature for many transactions. Digital authorization is increasingly common, especially with established banking relationships." A cold sensation settled in my stomach. "Are you suggesting he might have authorized the credit check himself, using my information?" "It's a possibility we need to investigate," Harriet replied carefully. "Before we proceed further, I'd like your permission to conduct some preliminary research. I have contacts at several financial institutions who can discreetly inquire about the lake property's financing structure without triggering alerts." "Of course," I agreed immediately. "In the meantime," she continued, "I recommend you take several protective measures." She outlined steps to secure my financial accounts: changing passwords, establishing two-factor authentication, placing fraud alerts with credit bureaus, and documenting all communication with James and Andrea moving forward. "Should I confront James about the loan or the credit check?" I asked, uncertain how to interact with my son now that suspicion had entered our relationship. Harriet considered this carefully. "Not yet. Let's gather more information first. If you're still invited to that separate birthday lunch Andrea mentioned, I suggest you attend and observe. Don't raise financial matters or show any indication that you're investigating. Your advantage currently is that they don't know you're aware of the credit inquiry." As I prepared to leave, Harriet added, "One more thing, Eleanor. What outcome are you hoping for here? What would justice look like for you?" The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on discovering what had happened that I hadn't clearly defined what I wanted to result from this investigation. "I don't want to destroy my relationship with my son," I said finally. "But I need accountability, recognition of what I've contributed, and security for my future. If James has used my financial information without permission, that breach of trust must be addressed." Harriet nodded. Keep that perspective in mind as we proceed. This isn't about revenge. It's about establishing appropriate boundaries and ensuring your retirement is secure. 3 days later, I received a text from James. Mom, sorry for the delayed response. Andrea and I can meet you for lunch next Saturday at Shoreline Bistro, 1 p.m., to celebrate my birthday. Looking forward to catching up. The message felt performative, an obligation fulfilled rather than a genuine desire to connect. Still, following Harriet's advice, I responded warmly. I'll be there. Looking forward to celebrating with you, the 4. Next morning, I received a call from Harriet. Eleanor, I've learned some interesting information about the lake property. Can you come to my office this afternoon? When I arrived, Harriet had several documents spread across her conference table. She closed the door carefully before explaining what she had discovered. The financing for James and Andrea's lake house is unusually complex, she began. Peninsula Trust provided the primary mortgage as expected. But there was indeed private financing involved for the remaining 30% of the purchase price. Pulse quickened. What kind of private financing? That's where it gets interesting, Harriet continued. The secondary loan was issued by an entity called Lakeside Legacy Holdings, LLC. My contact couldn't access the details of who owns this LLC, but it was formed just 2 weeks before their purchase closed. Could James have created this LLC himself? I asked, struggling to understand the implications. Possibly. LLCs are often used to separate assets or create privacy in real estate transactions. But here's where your loan becomes relevant. The amount needed to complete the lake house purchase after the primary mortgage was approximately $350,000. I frowned. That's much more than my outstanding loan amount. Yes, but combined with your home equity line of credit limit of $275,000, plus the $24,750 from your original loan, it would provide almost exactly that amount. The suggestion left me momentarily speechless. Could James have been investigating the possibility of using my financial resources, without my knowledge or consent, to purchase their luxury vacation property? That seems like a remarkable coincidence, I finally managed. Indeed, Harriet agreed. And coincidences of this precision are rare in financial matters. I've requested additional information, but it may take time to uncover the ownership structure of Lakeside Legacy Holdings. What should I do in the meantime? I asked, feeling increasingly uncertain about the upcoming lunch with James and Andrea. Proceed as planned with Saturday's lunch, Harriet advised. But I'd like you to wear this. She handed me what appeared to be an elegant brooch in the shape of a dragonfly. It contains a recording device. Washington is a 2-party consent. State for recordings, but if you simply keep this visible on your lapel, it constitutes implied consent if you discuss financial matters. I hesitated, the thought of secretly recording my son deeply uncomfortable. Is that really necessary? Eleanor, Harriet said gently, I hope you'll never need this recording. But if financial impropriety has occurred, documenting conversations may become essential for protecting your interests. I reluctantly accepted the brooch, tucking it into my purse. As I prepared to leave, Harriet added, One more thing. Look through these real estate listings for the lake development. She handed me printouts showing several properties, including James and Andrea's. Familiarize yourself with the values and features. Knowledge is power in this situation. Saturday arrived with unseasonably clear skies for November in Washington. I dressed carefully in a blue sweater that James had once complimented, pinning Harriet's dragonfly brooch prominently at my shoulder. The drive to Shoreline Bistro took 40 minutes, providing ample time to rehearse Harriet's guidance. Be natural, ask open-ended questions about the lake house, express appropriate interest without revealing suspicion. I arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a table with good lighting where the brooch would be clearly visible. As I waited, I reviewed the property listings Harriet had provided. noting that similar lakefront homes in the development had sold for between $1.2 and $1.5 million recently. At precisely 1:05, James and Andrea entered the restaurant. My son looked tired, with new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when I'd last seen him 6 months earlier. Andrea appeared polished as always in designer casual wear, her smile professional but not reaching her eyes as they approached my table. "Mom," James embraced me briefly. "Happy early birthday to me." "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I responded, genuinely happy to see him despite everything. 40 is a big milestone. As we settled into our seats and ordered drinks, I observed their dynamic closely. James deferred to Andrea on menu selections and conversation topics, his once confident demeanor subdued in her presence. She dominated the discussion, describing recent work achievements and social engagements with minimal input from him. "So," I said during a natural pause, "how are you enjoying the lake house? The photos look absolutely stunning." Andrea immediately brightened. "It's transformative. The air quality alone has improved James's persistent allergies, and the privacy is exactly what we needed after the intensity of the tech environment." The guest cottage looked particularly charming in the photos, I ventured, watching their reactions carefully. "Have you had many visitors stay there?" A quick glance passed between them before James answered. "Not yet. We're still furnishing it properly. Andrea's parents will be the first guests at Thanksgiving." "The cottage required more renovation than expected," Andrea added smoothly. "The previous owner had begun some updates but left them unfinished. The additional investment was substantial, but worthwhile for the property's overall value." "Additional investment?" I echoed innocently. "Beyond the purchase price?" Another glance between them. "Real estate at this level always involves unexpected expenses," Andrea explained with a dismissive wave. "Fortunately, our financial advisor helped structure everything efficiently." "Through Peninsula Trust?" I asked, the name slipping out before I could consider the implications. James's head snapped up, surprise evident in his expression. "How did you know we used Peninsula Trust?" I maintained a neutral expression despite my racing heart. "You mentioned them before, when we discussed my retirement planning options. Remember, you said your advisor there could help set up a fund for me." "Right," James said, though uncertainty lingered in his voice. "That's still the plan, by the way. Things have just been incredibly busy with work and the property." Andrea smoothly redirected the conversation to James's upcoming birthday weekend, describing elaborate plans for a private chef, water activities, and a wine tasting event. The message was clear. The celebration from which I had been excluded would be exceptional, making the current lunch seem like a perfunctory afterthought. As our meals arrived, I gathered my courage to ask the question that had been forming since my meeting with Harriet. "James, do you remember the loan I provided when you first moved to Seattle after college?" The question landed like a stone in still water. James set down his fork, color draining slightly from his face. "The relocation loan? Of course I remember. Was organizing some financial paperwork recently and came across the original documentation," I continued, keeping my tone conversational. "It reminded me that we never formally resolved that matter after your company's situation improved." Andrea's expression shifted from mild interest to sharp attention. "What loan is this?" she asked, looking between us. James cleared his throat uncomfortably. "When I graduated and got my first job offer, Mom helped with relocation expenses. It was before we met." "How much was this loan?" Andrea pressed, her tone suddenly businesslike. $30,000, I answered directly, with about $25,000 remaining outstanding. Andrea's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose fractionally. "I wasn't aware of any outstanding family loans." She turned to James. "You've never mentioned this in our financial planning discussions." James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It wasn't... Mom told me to pause payments when the company was struggling. It just never came up again." "Because you never brought it up," I pointed out gently. Even after your financial circumstances improved dramatically with the acquisition. The tension at our table was palpable now. Andrea's expression had hardened into something calculating, while James looked trapped between us. The birthday lunch had transformed into something entirely different. The first confrontation in what I now realized would be a necessary reckoning. The remainder of the birthday lunch passed in strained politeness. Andrea took control of the conversation, steering it firmly away from financial matters toward safe topics like an upcoming charity gala and mutual friends' recent vacation to Portugal. James contributed minimal responses, his discomfort evident, in his barely touched salmon entree and the way he avoided direct eye contact with either his wife or me. When the server brought the check, I reached for it immediately. "My treat for the birthday boy," I said with forced cheerfulness. James started to protest, but Andrea placed a restraining hand on his arm. "That's thoughtful, Eleanor," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "We appreciate it." As we stood to leave, James suddenly embraced me. Not the brief perfunctory hug from when they'd arrived, but something more desperate and genuine. "I love you, Mom," he whispered. "I'm sorry things have been so disconnected lately." The unexpected emotion in his voice nearly broke my resolve. For a moment, he was again my little boy. The child who had cried for his father, who had trusted me to make the world right, who had worked so hard to fulfill the potential I'd sacrificed everything to nurture. "I love you too," I replied softly. "Always." Andrea watched this exchange with barely concealed impatience, checking her designer watch pointedly. "We should get going, James. We have that call with the landscaper at 3. In the parking lot, James hesitated beside my car. "Mom, about that loan? I haven't forgotten. Things have just been complicated with the lake house expenses and some work uncertainty." "Work uncertainty?" I questioned, surprised given his seemingly secure position following the acquisition. A shadow crossed his face. "Nothing serious. Just some restructuring discussions. I'll call you next week, okay? We can talk about repayment terms." Before I could respond, Andrea called from their luxury SUV. "James, we're going to be late." He squeezed my hand briefly, then hurried to join his wife. I watched them drive away, noting the tension in my son's posture even from a distance. Something wasn't right. Beyond the loan discussion, beyond the uninvitation from his birthday. The confident, accomplished son I'd raised seemed diminished somehow in Andrea's presence. Instead of driving home, I found myself heading toward Harriet's office, guided by instinct rather than appointment. Fortunately, her assistant informed me she was between clients and could see me briefly. When I entered her office, Harriet immediately noticed my troubled expression. "The lunch didn't go well?" she asked, gesturing for me to sit. "It was revealing," I replied, unpinning the dragonfly brooch and placing it on her desk. James seemed genuinely uncomfortable when I mentioned the loan. Andrea claimed no knowledge of it, which seemed to create tension between them. Harriet connected the brooch to her computer, downloading the recording for later review. Did anything else noteworthy happen? I described James's comment about work uncertainty and the strange dynamic I'd observed between the couple. "He seems diminished somehow, less confident than the son I know." "Financial pressures can strain any relationship," Harriet observed. "Speaking of which, I've received some interesting information about Lakeside Legacy Holdings, the LLC involved in their property purchase." She retrieved a folder from her desk drawer. The LLC was indeed created shortly before their lake house purchase, registered through a corporate filing service that obscures the beneficial owners. However, my contact at the county records office found something intriguing in the property transfer history. Harriet opened the folder, revealing a property deed with highlighted sections. The lake property was originally listed at $175 million 6 months ago. James and Andrea purchased it for $1.2 million, a substantial discount in a competitive market. Perhaps it needed significant renovations, I suggested, recalling Andrea's comment about additional investments in the property. That's what I initially assumed, Harriet continued. But then I noticed this name on the original ownership records. She pointed to a highlighted line on the deed, Richard A. Jenkins Estate, my late husband's name. The world seemed to tilt sideways as I stared at the document. That's impossible. Richard died 38 years ago. Not your husband, Harriet clarified gently. This Richard Jenkins was apparently a distant cousin of your husband's, part of the English branch of the family. He died approximately 8 months ago, and the lake property was part of his estate holdings in the United States. My mind raced to process this information. Richard had mentioned distant relatives in England, but we never had contact with them after his death. I don't understand. How would James and Andrea purchase property from a relative I never knew existed? That's where it gets interesting, Harriet said, turning to another document. The executor of this Richard Jenkins's estate is listed as Thorndyke International Holdings. Thorndyke, like Andrea's maiden name? Harriet nodded. Andrea's father is Carlton Thorndyke, CEO of Thorndyke International. From what my contacts could determine, his company has managed various real estate investments for wealthy European clients for decades, potentially including your husband's extended family. The implications made my head spin. Are you suggesting Andrea knew about this property's connection to James's family before they purchased it? It seems highly probable. The timing aligns perfectly. Richard Jenkins dies. His estate goes into probate handled by Thorndyke International, and 8 months later, Andrea and James purchased the property at a significantly reduced price through an unusual financing arrangement involving a newly created LLC. A new thought struck me with such force that I gripped the arms of my chair. Wait, if Richard was James's distant cousin, would James potentially have been an heir to his estate? Even a minor one? Harriet's eyes widened slightly. That's an excellent question. With no direct descendants, distant cousins could indeed be in line for inheritance. But James would need to have been aware of the familial connection and filed a claim during probate. What if he wasn't aware? I pressed, a terrible suspicion forming. What if Andrea, through her father's company, discovered the connection but never informed James that he might have inheritance rights to the property? They ended up purchasing? Harriet sat back, considering this possibility. That would be a significant conflict of interest and potentially actionable fraud. An executor has fiduciary responsibilities to identify and notify potential heirs. Could that explain James's comment about work uncertainty? If he's recently discovered this deception? Possibly, Harriet acknowledged. Or there could be financial strain from overextending on the property purchase. Without seeing their complete financial picture, it's difficult to know for certain. I sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile these revelations with the son and daughter-in-law I thought I knew. James had always been honest to a fault, sometimes painfully direct but never deceptive. And while Andrea had always been cool toward me, outright fraud seemed beyond even my worst assessment of her character. What should I do with this information? I finally asked. Harriet considered carefully before responding. We need more definitive proof before making accusations. I can have my investigator look deeper into the estate proceedings and determine if James should have been notified as a potential heir. And the loan? Should I formally demand repayment? That depends on your ultimate goal, Harriet reminded me. Is it financial restitution or re-establishing appropriate boundaries with your son? Both, I admitted. I'm approaching retirement age with far less security than I should have after a lifetime of work. That $25,000 represents significant money for me, especially combined with the retirement support James promised but never delivered. Harriet nodded understanding. Then yes, I recommend we send a formal demand letter regarding the loan. It establishes your seriousness without immediately escalating to legal action. As I prepared to leave, a notification chimed on my phone. A text message from James. Mom, can we talk privately? No, Andrea. Important. Tomorrow? The unexpected request heightened my concern. In 7 years of marriage, James had rarely suggested meetings without Andrea present. Something significant had clearly shifted after our lunch conversation. My son wants to meet privately tomorrow, I told Harriet, showing her the message. That's promising, she observed. He may be ready to open up about the financial situation. Wear the recording brooch again, but proceed with compassion. If he's caught between loyalty to his wife and honesty with his mother, this won't be easy for him. I nodded, taking back the brooch and tucking it into my purse. I just want the truth, whatever it is. Truth has a way of costing more than we expect, Harriet cautioned. Be prepared for revelations that might change your relationship with James permanently. The drive home felt surreal, my mind racing with questions I'd never imagined asking about my only child. Had James knowingly participated in deception regarding his distant cousin's estate? Had he attempted to use my financial resources without permission to purchase the lake house? Or was he himself a victim of Andrea's manipulations, gradually, realizing the ethical compromises he'd been drawn into? When I arrived home, another message from James awaited. Green Lake Park, 10 a.m., by the West Shore Playground. Thank you. The specified location struck me as significant. Green Lake Park had been our special place throughout James's childhood. Every Sunday, weather permitting, we would walk the lake's perimeter while discussing his school projects, my teaching, challenges, our shared dreams. The West Shore Playground had been his favorite stop, with a rocket-shaped climbing structure that mirrored his space-obsessed elementary years. We hadn't visited there together in at least 15 years. That evening, I could barely focus on dinner or my usual routines. Instead, I found myself opening photo albums from James's childhood, tracing the trajectory from the toddler who'd lost his father to the accomplished young man who'd made me so proud at every milestone. Where had that person gone? How had he transformed into someone who would allow his wife to exclude his mother from his birthday celebration? Someone who might have considered using my financial resources without permission? Just before midnight, my phone rang. James's number. I answered immediately, heart pounding with concern about the late call. Mom? His voice sounded strained, almost unrecognizable. I've been thinking about our conversation today, about the loan. James, it's midnight. Is everything okay? Not really. A long pause followed, filled with the sound of his uneven breathing. I need to tell you something important, but not over the phone. Tomorrow at the park, okay? I needed to hear your voice tonight. The vulnerability in his words transported me back decades, to nights of childhood fevers, teenage heartbreaks, college application anxieties. I'm here, James. I've always been here. I know, he whispered. That's what makes this so much worse. Before I could ask what this referred to, he continued. I should have stood up to Andrea about the birthday weekend. I'm sorry you were uninvited. It was wrong. The simple acknowledgement, so long overdue, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Thank you for saying that. There's more to apologize for, he said cryptically. But tomorrow, okay? Try not to hate me when you hear everything. The call ended before I could respond, leaving me staring at the phone in confusion and growing alarm. Hate him? After a lifetime of unconditional love, what could possibly make me hate my only child? Sleep proved impossible as I cycled through scenarios, each more troubling than the last. By dawn, I had resigned myself to facing whatever difficult truth awaited at Green Lake Park. I dressed carefully in a warm sweater and comfortable shoes, pinning Harriet's dragonfly brooch to my collar almost as an afterthought. Whatever James needed to confess, I wanted to approach the conversation as his mother first, not as a potential legal adversary, As I grabbed my car keys, my phone chimed with an incoming email notification. The sender was unfamiliar. Carlton, Thorndike, tiholdings.com, with the subject line, regarding James Jenkins and Lakeside property. My finger hovered over the notification, uncertainty gripping me. Should I read this before meeting James? Would it color our conversation unfairly? After a moment's hesitation, I decided truth from any source was preferable to continuing in ignorance. I opened the email. Mrs. Jenkins, it began formally. This correspondence concerns the property at 1742 Lakeview Retreat, recently purchased by your son, James Jenkins, and my daughter, Andrea Thorndike Jenkins. It has come to my attention through Andrea that you have raised questions about the financing of this property and a personal loan you provided to James some years ago. While family financial matters would normally remain private, certain circumstances necessitate clarity. The property in question was previously owned by the estate of Richard A. Jenkins, a distant relation to your late husband. Through my company's role as executor, we became aware that James potentially qualified as a fractional heir to this estate. Rather than proceeding through standard probate protocols, which would have resulted in minimal distribution to James, given the number of potential heirs, we arranged a private purchase agreement through Lakeside Legacy Holdings LLC, an entity created specifically for this transaction. This arrangement provided James with full ownership of a significant property rather than a minor cash inheritance. The financing structure utilized a standard mortgage combined with a private loan secured by my personal guarantee. At no point was your home equity or financial information utilized in this transaction, despite some preliminary inquiries that may have occurred without your knowledge. I understand your concern for your son and your financial security. To address the outstanding personal loan mentioned during your recent lunch discussion, I have taken the liberty of arranging full repayment plus appropriate interest. Please expect bank transfer confirmation within 24 hours. Regarding your son's upcoming birthday celebration, Andrea has reconsidered the guest list and extends an invitation for you to attend. A formal invitation will follow. Respectfully, Carlton Thorndike, CEO, Thorndike International Holdings. I stared at the screen, reading and rereading the carefully worded message. Between the polished corporate language lay revelations that both answered questions and raised new ones. James had indeed been an heir to his distant cousin's estate, but had he known this before purchasing the property? The preliminary inquiries into my finances were acknowledged but dismissed as inconsequential. And now, suddenly, loan repayment and a birthday invitation were forthcoming. Not from my son or daughter-in-law, but from Andrea's father intervening from above. With the email still open on my phone, I drove to Green Lake Park, arriving 15 minutes before our scheduled meeting time. The morning was crisp and clear, the lake's surface reflecting autumn colors from surrounding trees. I found a bench near the rocket-shaped playground equipment and waited, wondering what version of my son would appear, and what truth he would finally share about the secret gift his father's family had unknowingly left him. A gift his wife's family had apparently manipulated for their own purposes. As I waited on the bench overlooking Green Lake, memories flooded back of countless weekend mornings spent here with James, teaching him to ride a bike along the path, feeding ducks despite the park's discouragements, celebrating his academic achievements with special picnics. This park had witnessed so many chapters of our lives together, the sanctuary we'd retreated to when home felt too empty without Richard. At precisely 10 a.m., I spotted James approaching from the parking lot. Even from a distance, his body language told a story. Shoulders hunched, steps hesitant, nothing like the confident stride he'd developed in his professional life. He wore jeans and a faded Washington State University sweatshirt from his college days rather than his usual business casual attire. When he reached me, I was struck by how exhausted he looked. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and new lines creased his forehead. Without speaking, He sat beside me on the bench, staring out at the lake where morning light danced across the rippling surface. I used to think this was the biggest body of water in the world, he finally said, his voice soft with remembrance. Remember how I insisted we could sail to Japan if we just had a big enough boat? You were very persuasive, I replied, smiling at the memory. You even drew blueprints for that boat. Your father would have been so proud of your engineering instincts, even at 6 years old. At the mention of Richard, James's expression tightened. That's actually related to why I needed to talk to you. He took a deep breath. Mom, I haven't been honest with you, and I haven't been the son you deserve, especially this past year. I remained silent, giving him space to continue at his own pace. The lake house, he began, then faltered. It's more complicated than you know. I decided to show my hand, at least partially. Does it have something to do with Richard Jenkins, your father's distant cousin in England? James's head snapped up, surprise evident in his widened eyes. How did you... He stopped, gathering himself. Yes, but let me explain from the beginning, please. He shifted to face me directly. About a year ago, Andrea's father mentioned that his company was handling an estate for someone named Jenkins, a property developer from England with holdings in Washington state. He asked if there might be any relation to Dad. And was there? I prompted when he paused. Yes, a second cousin once removed, apparently. Carlton, Andrea's father, said it was just a coincidence he'd noticed while reviewing estate documents. James rubbed his forehead. At first, it seemed like an interesting family connection, nothing more. Then Carlton mentioned that this Richard Jenkins owned a beautiful lakefront property that would be liquidated as part of the estate settlement. Did he tell you that you might be an heir to this estate? I asked directly. James looked away, discomfort evident in his posture. Not exactly. He said there were dozens of potential heirs, and the estate would likely be tied up in international probate for years. But he offered an alternative. His company could facilitate a private purchase at below market value as a family accommodation. And you agreed. We were already looking for a vacation property, James explained. Andrea fell in love with the lake house immediately. Carlton arranged all the financing through Peninsula Trust, where he sits on the board. Everything seemed perfectly above board. I took a deep breath. James, I received an email from Carlton Thorndyke this morning. He stated that you were in fact a potential heir to this property, and the purchase was arranged instead of your inheritance. His face paled. He contacted you directly? When? Just before I drove here, I replied, watching his reaction carefully. He also mentioned preliminary inquiries into my finances that occurred without my knowledge. Can you explain that? James closed his eyes briefly, shame written across his features. That's the hardest part to explain, and what I most need to apologize for. He turned toward me, raw emotion in his expression. When we decided to purchase the lake house, we needed additional funding beyond the primary mortgage. Carlton suggested creating an LLC for the secondary financing. During the planning discussions, Andrea asked about your financial situation, whether you had resources that could be incorporated into our planning. My resources? I echoed, keeping my voice level despite the growing indignation. You mean the home equity line I took out to help you start your career? The line that's secured by my home? Yes, he admitted, unable to meet my eyes. Andrea suggested we could leverage that existing relationship, since I was already authorized on your accounts for emergency purposes. The implication was clear, and exactly what Harriet had suspected. You were considering using my home, equity without telling me, for your vacation property? I didn't agree to it, James insisted, finally looking at me directly. But I didn't immediately refuse either, which was wrong. Andrea and her father discussed it as a legitimate option. A family financing arrangement, they called it. They even ran a preliminary credit check to assess feasibility. Without my knowledge or permission, I stated flatly. Yes, he acknowledged, shame evident in his voice. When I realized what was happening, that they were treating your financial resources as an extension of our own, I put a stop to it. That's when Carlton arranged the alternative financing through his personal guarantee. I sat with this information, processing the multiple layers of betrayal. My son had considered using my financial resources without permission, allowed a credit check to be run in my name, and hidden his potential inheritance rights to a property connected to his father's family. The loan I mentioned at lunch yesterday, I said after a moment. You never intended to repay it, did you? Not until I brought it up publicly. James flinched as if I'd struck him. That's not true. With the lake house expenses, it wasn't a priority. I convinced myself you didn't need the money, that you'd offered it freely as a mother's support. I did offer it freely, I confirmed. But it was still a loan, James. One you promised to repay every penny when you graduated. One that became due in full when your financial circumstances improved dramatically with the acquisition. I know, he whispered. There's no excuse. We sat in silence for several minutes, watching a family with young children arrive at the playground. The mother helped a toddler onto a swing, while the father steadied a slightly older child on the rocket climber James had loved decades earlier. The parallels to our own past visits here weren't lost on either of us. Carlton's email mentioned he's arranged repayment of my loan, I finally said. James nodded miserably. After your mention of it at lunch, Andrea was furious that I'd never disclosed it in our financial planning. She called her father and he took over the situation, as he always does. The defeat in his voice triggered a maternal concern that transcended my anger. James, what's really happening here? This isn't just about a loan or a lake house. Something has changed in you. He stared at his hands for a long moment before responding. I've lost myself, Mom. Somewhere between marrying Andrea, joining her social circle, and trying to meet the Thorndike family's expectations. I've become someone I don't recognize anymore. What expectations? I prompted gently. Success on their terms, appearances, connections with the right people. He gestured vaguely. The birthday weekend you weren't invited to? It's not really a celebration. It's a networking event Andrea and Carlton arranged with potential investors for the new company division I'm leading. The guest list was determined by net worth and industry influence. The admission explained. Much about Andrea's insistence that I would feel out of place among their social circle. A retired teacher had no value in their calculation of worthwhile connections. And the work uncertainty you mentioned yesterday? I asked. The restructuring. Puts me directly under Carlton's oversight in the new corporate alignment. He orchestrated the entire arrangement. My promotion looks impressive on paper, but I've essentially been absorbed into Thorndike International's sphere of influence. I began to see the fuller picture. James hadn't just married Andrea. He'd been systematically incorporated into her family's business and social ecosystem, gradually surrendering his independence in exchange for the trappings of success they offered. The lake house was the tipping point, James continued unprompted. When I discovered it had belonged to Dad's family, that there was this connection to the father I barely remember, it meant something special to me. But to Andrea and Carlton, it was just another strategic asset acquisition. And the guest cottage? I ventured. The one that would have been perfect for my retirement, but Andrea said was needed for visiting friends and her parents? James's expression crumpled further. That was the breaking point for me. When you suggested moving closer, into the cottage, I thought it was perfect. Having you nearby, on property that connects to Dad's family. It felt right. But Andrea and Carlton were adamantly opposed. Why? I pressed, though I suspected the answer. Control, James said simply. Having you there would mean an independent voice. Someone who remembers who I was before I entered their world. Someone whose value system doesn't revolve around wealth and connections. He looked at me with profound sadness. Someone who loves me for reasons that have nothing to do with what I can provide or what doors I can open. The raw honesty of his assessment broke through the last of my defensive anger. This was my son, not a financial adversary or legal opponent, but my child caught in a dysfunctional situation that had gradually tightened around him like a trap. "What do you want, James?" I asked softly. Not what Andrea wants, or what Carlton expects, or what I might hope for. What do you want for your life? He seemed startled by the question, as if no one had asked him that in a very long time. I want... He began hesitantly, then gained conviction. I want to reclaim some measure of independence. I want a relationship with my mother that isn't filtered through Andrea's priorities. I want to honor Dad's memory by acknowledging our family connections, not exploiting them for financial gain. As he spoke, his posture straightened slightly. Hints of the confident son I remembered emerging through the corporate veneer that had overlaid his authentic self. Carlton's email mentioned you've been reinvited to the birthday weekend, I noted. Will you accept if I attend? James's expression darkened. That's another Carlton solution, not a genuine change of heart from Andrea. She's furious about the loan discussion and what she calls my disloyalty in meeting you privately today. Then what happens next? I asked. He took a deep breath, seeming to make a decision. I've been doing some research since our lunch yesterday. The lake property, it turns out I wasn't just a minor potential heir. As Dad's only child, I would have had primary claim through direct lineage, regardless of how distant the cousin relationship was. This revelation aligned with Harriet's suspicions. And Carlton knew this? His company was the executor. They had access to all the genealogical information. James's voice had taken on a new edge, anger finally breaking through the resignation. Instead of informing me of my inheritance rights, they structured a purchase where I paid nearly $1 million for property that likely should have come to me directly. That's... I searched for the appropriate word. Unconscionable. It's potentially criminal, James corrected, surprising me with his directness. I consulted an attorney last night, someone completely independent from Thorndike influence. He believes this constitutes executor fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. I realized with a surge of maternal pride that despite everything, the principled son I'd raised still existed beneath the compromises he'd made. What will you do? I'm meeting with the attorney again tomorrow to review all the documentation. If the evidence supports it, I'll be filing formal complaints with the State Bar Association and possibly criminal charges. His voice was steady now, determination replacing defeat. And I've told Andrea I'm not attending the birthday networking event. I've suggested we seek marriage counseling instead. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable, as if naming the manipulation aloud had broken some of its power over him. For the first time in our conversation, I saw glimpses of the son I remembered. Thoughtful, ethical, willing to stand for what was right even when difficult. I'm proud of you, I said simply. His eyes filled with tears. How can you say that after everything I've done or failed to do? Because you're finding your way back to yourself, I explained, taking his hand. That takes more courage than following someone else's path, no matter how golden it appears. As we sat together on that park bench, watching children play on the same equipment James had enjoyed decades earlier, I realized that my secret gift wasn't just the unknown family connection to the lake property. It was this moment of truth between us, painful but necessary, clearing away pretense and manipulation to reveal the authentic relationship that had always been our foundation. The loan would be repaid, according to Carlton's email. The credit check on my accounts would be investigated through proper channels. The question of James's rightful inheritance would be pursued with legal guidance. But most importantly, my son was beginning to reclaim his own voice and values. For a mother who had sacrificed everything to raise a child of integrity, no birthday invitation or lakefront cottage could compare to that gift. 3 months have passed since that pivotal conversation with James at Green Lake Park. The seasons have changed, holiday decorations have come and gone, and our lives have transformed in ways I never could have imagined when Andrea first told me I wasn't welcome at my son's 40th birthday celebration. That birthday weekend never happened, at least not in the form Andrea and her father had planned. Instead of hosting an elaborate networking event disguised as a personal milestone, James spent his 40th birthday weekend at my modest home, helping me sort through decades of family photographs and memorabilia. We rediscovered treasures neither of us had seen in years: Richard's pilot logbooks, James's childhood drawings, faded postcards from places we'd visited together as a family before tragedy struck. "I can't believe you kept all this," James marveled, carefully turning pages in a scrapbook of his science fair achievements. "Every ribbon, every certificate." "Of course I did," I replied, watching him reconnect with his younger self through these artifacts. "These aren't just papers, they're the story of who you are and where you came from." That weekend became a different kind of celebration, not of business connections or social status, but of authentic family bonds and shared history. We ordered takeout from James's favorite childhood restaurants, watched old movies we'd enjoyed together when he was growing up, and talked honestly about the past, present, and future in ways we hadn't managed in years. Andrea did not join us. By then, she and James were living separately while attempting couples counseling, a development that came swiftly after the legal proceedings began regarding the lake property. The investigation into Carlton Thorndyke's handling of Richard Jenkins's estate moved quickly once James filed formal complaints with the State Bar Association and regulatory authorities. Harriet connected us with a specialized estate fraud attorney, who took immediate action, filing for injunctive relief to prevent any further transactions related to the property while the investigation proceeded. What emerged through discovery was even more troubling than we had initially suspected. Carlton's company had identified James as the primary heir to Richard Jenkins's estate nearly 18 months earlier, long before approaching him about purchasing the property. Internal emails revealed deliberate strategies to obscure James's inheritance rights, with Andrea fully aware of the deception from the beginning. "I still can't believe she knew everything," James told me one evening, his voice hollow with lingering disbelief. "That she could look me in the eye every day while helping her father essentially steal my inheritance." The legal consequences came swiftly. Carlton Thorndyke faced disbarment proceedings and multiple civil suits from other estates his company had managed. Thorndyke International's reputation suffered irreparable damage as additional instances of executor fraud came to light. Andrea, while not directly liable in a legal sense, had been complicit in the deception, a betrayal James found impossible to reconcile with the marriage he thought they had built. As promised in his email, Carlton had arranged repayment of my loan to James. $24,150 plus appropriate interest appeared in my account the day after our lunch conversation. But this gesture, clearly intended to make the problem disappear, came far too late to repair the damage his family had caused. The lake house property was eventually legally recognized as James's rightful inheritance, with the purchase agreement nullified and the property title transferred directly to him through proper inheritance channels. Peninsula Trust, implicated in the questionable financing arrangements, found itself under regulatory scrutiny and quickly settled their portion of the case, refunding all fees and mortgage payments James had made during the fraudulent transaction. Throughout this legal whirlwind, James and I rebuilt our relationship one conversation at a time. The son who had been gradually absorbed into the Thorndyke family's web of influence reemerged, reconnecting with his own values and priorities. He began seeing a therapist to process not only the marriage difficulties, but also the subtle coercion he'd experienced over years of increasing entanglement with Andrea's family. "I kept making small compromises," he explained during one of our Sunday dinners, a tradition we had reinstated. "Each one seemed reasonable in isolation, but together, they changed the fundamental direction of my life." That's how influence often works, I observed, drawing on decades of watching students navigate peer pressure. Not through dramatic ultimatums, but through incremental shifts that go unnoticed until you're somewhere you never intended to be. The external changes in James's life were significant. Separation from Andrea, legal battles with his in-laws, restructuring his career to extricate himself from Thorndike business connections. But the internal transformation was even more profound. The confidence that had once made him exceptional in his field returned, now tempered with wisdom about the price of success without integrity. As for me, my life transformed as well, in ways I never expected when this journey began. The loan repayment provided immediate financial breathing room, but the eventual settlement from the estate fraud case delivered something far more significant: genuine retirement security. As Richard Jenkins's rightful heir, James was entitled not only to the lake property but to the entirety of his distant cousin's Washington state holdings, which included several rental properties and investment accounts. Once these assets were properly transferred through legitimate estate proceedings, James made an immediate decision. "Half of this belongs to you, Mom," he declared, presenting me with documentation for a trust established in my name. "Without Dad, I wouldn't have any connection to this inheritance. And without you preserving our family history and standing up for what's right, I might never have discovered the truth." I initially protested, feeling uncomfortable accepting such a significant gift. But James was adamant. "This isn't charity," he insisted, echoing words I had once used about his education. "It's recognition of our family legacy, one you've carried alone for far too long." The trust provided enough income to allow me to retire comfortably from teaching at the end of the school year, fulfilling the promise James had made but couldn't deliver through his original intentions. More significantly, it represented tangible acknowledgement of my lifetime of sacrifice, financial validation I had never expected but deeply appreciated receiving. As for the lake house, the property that had sparked this entire chain of events, its future took a turn neither James nor I initially anticipated. Rather than keeping it as a private residence, James decided to convert it into a science and technology retreat center for underprivileged youth interested in STEM careers. "The Richard Jenkins Memorial Science Camp," he explained as we toured the property together after the legal transfers were completed, named for both my father and his distant cousin, honoring our family's legacy while creating opportunities for kids who might not otherwise have access to advanced technology education. The main house was being renovated to accommodate classroom, activities, and collaborative workspaces, and the guest cottage, the one Andrea had insisted was too valuable for me to occupy, was being prepared as my permanent residence as the retreat center's education director. "Are you sure about this role?" James asked as we stood on the cottage's porch, watching sunset colors reflect across the lake. "It's not quite the peaceful retirement we originally discussed." I laughed, feeling more energized than I had in years. After 30 years teaching high school science, guiding curriculum for a technology camp is hardly stressful. Besides, what better use of my experience? These students need advocates who understand both education and overcoming obstacles. The first session of the Richard Jenkins Memorial Science Camp welcomed 20 students from underserved communities. 2 months later, James took a sabbatical from his corporate position to help launch the program, working alongside me to create a curriculum that balanced technical skills with character development. Watching him mentor young people with the same patience and encouragement I had once shown him became one of the greatest joys of my life. As for Andrea, her path diverged permanently from ours. The divorce proceedings were finalized quietly, with James requesting no alimony despite his legal entitlement to compensation for the inheritance fraud. "I just want a clean break," he explained. "No ongoing financial entanglements. No reason for continued communication." Carlton Thorndike eventually faced criminal charges for executor fraud and financial exploitation, a public downfall that rocked the corporate community where he had once been revered. Andrea relocated to Boston, returning to her family's east. coast connections, and reclaiming her maiden name professionally. She made no attempt to contact either James or me once the legal matters concluded. Today, as I sit on my cottage porch watching a new group of students arrive for the summer session, I reflect on the extraordinary journey that began with a painful exclusion. The photograph that started this story, the one of 5-year-old James blowing out birthday candles while I watched proudly, now sits on my desk inside the cottage, joined by newer images: James cutting the ribbon at the retreat center's opening ceremony. Both of us surrounded by the first graduating class of camp participants, a sunset view of the lake that connects us to Richard's family legacy. The lakefront property that Andrea and her father tried to take through deception has become something neither of them could have imagined. Not a status symbol or networking venue, but a place of transformation for disadvantaged young people with dreams bigger than their circumstances. In this, it mirrors the inheritance that truly matters in life. Not money or property, but values, purpose, and authentic connection. James visits my cottage several times weekly, often staying for dinner after camp activities conclude. During one such evening recently, he paused while helping me wash dishes, a chore he'd always shared willingly since childhood. "You know what I realized the other day?" he said, handing me a plate to dry. "I've never missed a birthday with you. Not in 40 years. Even when I was traveling for work, we'd at least have a phone call." Until Andrea tried to break that streak, I noted, the hurt of that exclusion now dulled by time and subsequent healing. "That was never going to happen," James said firmly. "Even if I hadn't discovered the truth about everything else, I would have found a way to celebrate with you separately. Some bonds can't be broken by outside interference." His words captured perfectly what I had come to understand through this journey. The secret gift mentioned in this story's title wasn't just the unexpected inheritance from Richard's distant cousin. It was the unbreakable connection between mother and son, a bond tested by time, threatened by outside influence, but ultimately strengthened through crisis. Andrea told me I wasn't invited to my son's birthday celebration, never knowing that her attempt to sever that connection would ultimately reveal its true strength and unravel the web of deception she had helped weave. The property she and her father coveted has become not a symbol of exclusion, but a center of inclusion, creating opportunities for young people who, like James once was, are being raised by parents making tremendous sacrifices for their future. As the sun sets over the lake that now represents new beginnings rather than painful exclusion, I silently thank Andrea for the uninvitation that started this journey. Sometimes being shut out of one door opens the path to exactly where you're meant to be, surrounded by authentic love, meaningful purpose, and the sweet vindication of truth finally revealed. For those watching who might be experiencing family difficulties of your own, remember this. Stand firmly in your truth, maintain your dignity, and trust that genuine relationships will ultimately reveal themselves through both word and action. The most valuable inheritances aren't properties or possessions, but the legacy of integrity we build through our choices, especially when those choices are difficult. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.